Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I am Dr. Nguyen from King's College London, and today I'm going to deliver a keynote on the topic of flexible working. The COVID-19 pandemic marked one of the most dramatic and rapid transformations of work in modern history. Almost overnight, millions of employees across the globe were forced to work from home, adopt digital communication tools, and reconfigure how work fit into their daily lives. What initially appeared to be a temporary emergency response has now become a structural feature of contemporary work. Flexible working and hybrid working arrangements are no longer exceptions or perks for many organizations and workers. They are now the new norm. And this raises an important question for both scholars and practitioners. What do we actually know about the consequences of flexible working in the post-COVID context? In this talk today, I'm going to synthesize existing academic research findings on flexible working, focusing on three key outcome domains that are dominating the literature: job satisfaction, well-being, and loneliness or social connection. I'm also going to discuss the theoretical frameworks that underpin this work before highlighting critical gaps that remain, particularly around the need for longitudinal and contextualized evidence. So, to truly understand why this topic matters, it is important to appreciate the scale and permanence of the shift that we are witnessing. During the height of the pandemic, around 46% of UK workers performed some or all of their work remotely. Crucially, rather than returning to pre-pandemic patterns, remote or hybrid working have continued to expand. By 2025, over 60% of the UK workers report access to some form of hybrid working arrangement, according to the Office for National Statistics. This persistence reflects not only technological feasibility, but also changing expectations. Research by Barbero, Bloom, and Davids show that around 80% of employees now express a preference for having paid work from home days. At the same time, allowing around 20% of working time to be spent at home, which is a substantial increase compared to pre-COVID levels. What this tells us is that flexible working is not a transient phenomenon. It is not a temporary situation. It is reshaping labor markets, organizational design, and employee expectations. And as such, understanding its consequences is not optional. It is instead very, very essential. So, what is flexible working? One of the challenges in the literature is that flexible working is often treated as a single concept, where in reality it compasses multiple dimensions. First, there is location-based flexibility, the ability to work outside the traditional office, most commonly from home. And second, there is time-based flexibility, such as flexi-time or compressed working hours. And third, many contemporary arrangements combine these elements into hybrid working models. A particularly important distinction introduced by Yang and colleagues is between replacement working from home and extension working from home. Replacement working from home involves substituting office hours with home working during normal working time. Extension working from home, by contrast, involves work expanding beyond the normal working hours. For example, checking emails late at night simply because work is already there, so the always on culture. And finally, recent work also distinguishes between formal flexible working arrangements and informal flexibility or ideals negotiated between employees and managers. These distinctions matter because they help to explain why findings in the literatures are often very, very mixed. So, what have we known so far about the topic? When we step back and look across systematic reviews and meta-analysis, a clear pattern emerges. Flexible working is associated with both benefits and costs. On the positive side, reviews consistently report associations with higher job satisfaction, greater perceived autonomy, and in some cases, improved engagement and reduced turnover intentions. These findings are summarized in large-scale reviews by Taramapos and colleagues, and more recently by Harrop and colleagues' meta-analysis. At the same time, these same reviews highlight risks, particularly around burned out, work-life boundary erosion, and social isolation. Soger and colleagues describe this as the other phase of flexible working. The same practices that enable autonomy may also intensify work and undermine recovery. And rather than asking whether flexible working is good or bad, the literature increasingly suggests we should ask, under what conditions does flexibility function as a resource and when does it become a demand? And job satisfaction is the outcome where the evidence is strongest and most consistent. Across countries, sectors, and methodologies, flexible working and particularly hybrid arrangements is generally associated with higher job satisfaction. Randomized and quasi-experimental studies, including Bloom and colleagues' well-known hybrid work trial, show that employees working from home 2 days per week report higher satisfaction compared to those working fully on site. Observational studies similarly report lower turnover intentions and greater positive attitudes towards work. The mechanisms underpinning these relationships are relatively well established. Flexible working reduces commuting time, increasing perceived autonomy, and allows better alignment between work demands and personal needs. Classical job satisfaction theory suggests that satisfaction emerges when effort is balanced by reward and flexibility is increasingly perceived as a valued reward. However, this relationship is not limitless. Evidence exists suggests that satisfaction gains plateau and may even reverse at high levels of home working. And this is largely due to social and professional isolation. And this non-linear relationship is critical to understanding why more flexibility doesn't automatically guarantee better outcomes. So, importantly, the satisfaction benefits of flexible working are not evenly distributed. Gender is one of the most debated moderators. Early studies, such as Whitley work, suggest that flexible working benefited men's job satisfaction more than women's, potentially because women face greater domestic demands around caregiving and that limited their ability to capitalize on flexible working. However, more recent evidence from the UK longitudinal data suggests that the opposite is true. Women may benefit more from flexi-time opportunities, particularly when managing disproportionate caregiving duties. And this highlights how social context and institutional support can shape the outcomes. Caregiving responsibilities themselves are a key moderator. Kosek and Lee study argue that flexibility can be essential for inclusion, particularly for carers, but only when workload and expectations are adjusted accordingly. And finally, job design and sector matter. Flexible working appears better suited for autonomous, task-based roles than to highly interdependent or relational work. And despite the volume of the research, longitudinal evidence remains relatively scarce. However, the studies that do exist provide some cautious optimism for us to look at. So, for example, Cornett and colleagues' multiple country longitudinal analysis shows that job satisfaction remained broadly stable among employees working from home during and beyond the pandemic. And importantly, there was no systematic decline over time. Similarly, Bloom and colleagues' randomized trial found that satisfaction gains persisted across a 6-month period. Tagemaya and colleagues also report no major deterioration in work functioning over time. But that said, most longitudinal studies are still relatively short and focus on the early post-pandemic periods. Whether these patterns persist over time or many, many years remain an open question for us to explore. So next, let's talk about well-being. Well-being outcomes are considerably more mixed than the satisfaction outcomes. On one hand, flexible working is associated with reduced stress, greater engagement, and improved work-life balance. Studies comparing teleworking days to office days within the same individuals consistently show better well-being on home working days. On the other hand, flexible working can lengthen workdays and intensify work. Barber and Santuzi's concept of telepressure captures the psychological urge to respond quickly to work communications, which is exacerbated when boundaries are blurred. Work-life balance theory suggests that well-being depends on maintaining harmony between roles. When flexible working undermines role separation, it can increase strain rather than alleviate it. So, flexible working appears beneficial for well-being only when it genuinely reduces demand rather than subtly expanding them. So let's talk about physical well-being. Physical well-being is a dimension that receives far less attention, yet many carry significant long-term consequences. Working from home often involves prolonged sitting, suboptimal workstations, and increased screen time. Studies report higher rates of muscular discomfort and sleep disruption among remote workers. For example, Jaft et al. Quality research highlights how the absence of ergonomic resources can transform flexible work into a physical strain. Strolls and colleagues also show that organizational investment in ergonomic equipment can buffer against these negative effects. And these findings suggest that well-being discussions should move beyond mental health alone and consider the embodied realities of remote working. Loneliness emerges as one of the most consistent negative outcomes associated with extensive remote working. While communication technologies allows for task coordination, they struggle to replicate that informal, spontaneous interaction that foster belonging for workers. Systematic reviews show that reduced interaction with colleagues and supervisors is strongly linked to the feelings of isolation. Mastan and colleagues introduced the concept of psychological distance, showing that physical separation from leaders can translate into reduced support, poorer coping, and lower performance. And this matters because supervisors play a critical role in providing clarity, reassurance, and emotional support, functions that are harder to enact remotely without intentional effort. The social costs of flexible working are not evenly distributed. New employees appear particularly vulnerable without established relationships. Remote onboarding can hinder socialization, learning, and identity formation. Jav and colleagues show that new joiners often report slower skilled acquisition and greater loneliness. At the organizational level, Yang and colleagues demonstrate that remote work reduces cross-team collaboration, while Haynes and colleagues highlight fragmentation among senior leaders working asynchronously. These findings raises concerns about longer-term organizational cohesion, and knowledge sharing. So, how can we use theory to explain those patterns that we just detected across the literature? Several theoretical frameworks can help to explain why flexible working produce such varied outcomes. First, the job demand resource theory suggests that flexibility can act as a job resource, buffering demands, but only when it does not create new demands. Conservation of resource theory emphasizes how flexibility enables individuals to accumulate or protect resources such as time or energy, but also how resource loss spirals can occur when boundaries collapse. And finally, the social exchange theory highlights the reciprocity when flexibility is perceived as organizational support, employees reciprocate with engagement. However, as flexible working becomes expected, this mechanism may be weakened over time. So, despite the rapid growth in the literature, important gaps remain. What can we see from the gaps? Firstly, most studies rely on cross-sectional self-reported data, and that limits the causal inference and obscuring the long-term trajectories. Loneliness and well-being in particular may accumulate over time in ways we do not yet understand. So there's also limited comparative research across sectors and occupations, and that raises concerns about the generalizability. And finally, supervisory support mechanisms are often involved but rarely measured directly. And addressing these gaps requires robust, longitudinal, and contextualized research design. So, what should we conclude? I'm going to offer some take-home messages. To conclude, flexible working is no longer an optional. It's a defining features of the post-COVID context that we are living in. The evidence shows that clear benefits, particularly for job satisfaction, but also highlight the risk for well-being and social connection. And these outcomes are highly conditional, and those are shaped by the work design of the organization, the leadership styles of the managers and the supervisors, and the boundaries between work and home and the individual circumstances. And we are talking about whether, in terms of the gender, in terms of whether they have the caregiving responsibilities and whether or not they are working in jobs that require interactions or jobs that entitle them with a certain degree of autonomy. So all of the factors that are associated to the individual differences, but also the nature of the work and the types the types of the organizations should all be taken together to um, to explore and to help with the design of future research. So that's the end of the keynote for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and reflections on this. Thank you.